Good then.
He's all ready to go.
Yeah.
Tape speed.
Okay. Tom, in retrospect, Creedence Clearwater can certainly be hailed as the ultimate American band. Why do you think that is?
Oh, well, before I go on, should I mention Creedence Clearwater in the answer?
Creedence Clearwater, yeah.
Okay. Creedence Clearwater Revival is being remembered, you're saying remembered as an ultimate rock and roll band. I think it's a very nice compliment, and I really can't say why, other than just maybe the type of rock and roll that we chose to play. That was a combination of black and country music, you know, kind of like how it all sort of came together, and in much the same way that Chuck Berry put it all together. It's, you know, it's the only thing I can think of.
You guys did songs such as, you know, Bad Moon Rising and Fortunate Son and Lodi that sort of commented on America's working man's point of view and came across very much that way. What was the inspiration for these songs?
I think, especially in terms of the way John would write, I think he was thinking not to just write the same old kind of love songs. You know, we played around with a few love songs like Susie Q and I Put a Spell on You, those kind of songs. But when John chose to write, he seemed to want to get deeper into what was going on at the time in the late '60s. You know, and a lot of it had to do with the plight of the working man and young people, men and women who were confronted with the war and how it was affecting them in a lot of ways, and he chose to write about that.
Who were the musical heroes of the bands?
It's a broad question if you want to know who the musical heroes of the whole band were. You know, it covers a lot of people.
Let's talk about you. Who are your musical heroes? Who did you grow up listening to?
I grew up listening mainly at the very beginning to the rhythm and blues vocal groups of the West Coast and some of the ones from the East Coast, like the Five Satins, and on the West Coast, the Penguins and the Medallions. And then I got into the blues artists like Jimmy Reed and B.B. King a little bit, and Jesse Lee Sims. When I first started listening, there's no such thing as top 40 radio yet. So in order to hear what I liked, it was either black radio or pop stations that would play mostly Patti Page or something. So I wasn't too interested in that, you know.
How do you think that your personal musical tastes and influences, how do you think that propelled the music of the group along? I mean, how did that come out in the sound of Creedence?
Well, I think everybody in the band was feeling pretty much the same way about the way that pop music was in the middle 50s or late 50s when we first formed, and we didn't consciously go out of our way to try to sound like a black band. You know, there was parts of country in it. It's just that it was really that we liked black music better than the kind of white music that was being presented to us at the time. That, for instance, the Philadelphia type of music that was being pawned off as rock and roll was not really what we thought it was about. So we kind of were more, I don't know, we were more influenced by the guitar bands, Elvis Presley, for instance, or Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Eddie Cochran, in terms of white people that were playing that kind of music, you know. But our early heroes were definitely black, so it kind of maybe just unconsciously came together.
It can be said that early Creedence Clearwater revival music was swamp influenced. What does that mean, and how did that come about?
What is swamp rock is really, it was funny how people put that name on it, swamp rock or bayou rock, simply because we called the second album Bayou Country, and it suddenly became, this was a kind of music. It had really been around before, you know, somebody like Lightning Hopkins or Slim Harpo had already sort of done that kind of music, but it was an area of mystery to us, and a lot of vibrato, pop staples kind of thing on the guitar, and John's vocal, you know, is more like Howlin' Wolf than Fabian, for instance. And it was just something that we evolved to, but we didn't set out to create Bayou rock.
Were any of the band members, excuse my ignorance here with this question, were any of the band members from any Bayou areas?
Everyone in the band was born in the Bay Area, either Berkeley, Oakland, or Palo Alto.
No bayous around there.
No, it was, all the experience really was from listening to the radio. Not, it's like the music that we liked was from the South, but we never got to go there until well after the band was, you know, popular. And we went to Baton Rouge and to the Crossroads and got to see all those places. We got to see Fireflies.
What was it, having been influenced by this sort of music in this area of the country? What are your memories of finally getting to go there? Was it what you had visualized from the music, or was it totally different to you?
The thing that surprised me the most was how depressed the areas were. That it was still like what I pictured it to be like in the 30s. It was still like that, you know, houses up on stilts and a lot of poverty, and it wasn't real romantic once you saw it, what it was really like.
I think that happens a lot. You know, I know it's happened with me a lot in my life. You know, you have these sort of wonderful romantic images of someplace, and then you go there and you go,
Yeah.
ooh, like Hollywood, exactly.
When I first went to Hollywood in 1959, it was still pretty exciting, you know, because I was 17. It was a big deal. But when I went back a few years later, there was hardly any music or movie things left actually in the city of Hollywood. It was all outside of it, you know. So,
Right.
but I guess it just represents, the word represents something to, you know, people that don't live here.
Oh, sure. I had that very much that sort of same feeling the first time I ever went to New Orleans. You know, I was expecting it to be, you know, jazz being played on every corner and everything. No, it's become pretty commercial. Let's no, let's not. Let's go to a different question. The late and mid '60s, or the mid '60s, was a time of change and social protest, and really sort of still of innocence before the entire change happened. What are your memories of that period?
Well, my memories are really vivid of the early '60s and actually the whole change from middle to the end. I was in Berkeley at the time. I was born there, and I went all through school in Berkeley. So that when that all changed, when Mario Savio started speaking about, you know, freedom of speech and the steps at Cal Berkeley, it was just roughly, you know, less than a year before the Beatles hit, and this whole social revolution took place, you know, all over the world. And it really, in Berkeley, it became very obvious. What used to be a real kind of a quiet town as I was growing up turned into just a haven of political thinking, you know. And it was, there were a lot of weirdos, but there were also a lot of people who had right things to say, and it took me, when it first happened, I wasn't against the war in Vietnam. By the time 1966, 67 came around, I had completely changed my mind from where I was, and I was totally against the war, you know. It was an awakening more than anything for me. And then the Summer of Love '67 was when the band, like our band, really went completely full time. We stopped going to school and working on the side and all that, you know. So I probably wouldn't be the person I am if it hadn't happened that way. Living in Berkeley and the '60s themselves, you know, I might have been a completely different person.
When you were living through it, and let me start again. Looking back on it now, particularly that period in that summer of '67, is very important to what happened to a lot of people, like you just said, and to America. At the time that you were living through it, did you realize how important it was? Did you have any sort of idea what was going on, how big it was?
It was so important to me, and I was so aware of it that when I talked to other people about it and they didn't understand me, I couldn't figure out how they couldn't see what was going on around him. It was such a big change to me, you know. It was like my hair just grew, you know, and down to my shoulders by itself, you know, no effort, and everything just kind of just went.
That's neat. It seems like during that time, people seem to care more deeply about social issues, and musicians in particular. Do you think that music had the power or helped to change things because of what musicians were doing?
I think that the music had a lot to do with the way people were changed, and I think that the Beatles had more to do with that change than anyone else. They were so outspoken every time they did interviews, not like me, you know, I keep it all hid. No, they were very outspoken, you know, especially John Lennon, of course, and they made everybody think, especially if you were anywhere near their age and were thinking, just thinking at all. You know, you didn't have to be a musician to know what the Beatles were all about. So the music was like getting your attention, and then as soon as they opened their mouth, you'd go, oh, you know, and it might have been something you hadn't thought about. And I personally think that they changed the world. You know, they came along and changed the world.
Do you think that, musicians have, in the past couple of years, they seem to be being, as I was talking to the other guys about, being very involved in political issues. Do you see it as being parallel to what was going on in the 60s? Do you think that people are getting to a point where they're caring again?
That's an interesting question, you know, as to think was there a period of time when people stopped caring as opposed to now when everyone seems to be getting involved in at least trying to help their fellow man. Maybe it isn't so much against any particular war, but they're trying to take whatever power they have through music and generate money anyway, you know, to help people that are less fortunate. And I don't know though if you could compare it to the 60s, you know, it's like it's just a different time.
Do you think that lyrics today and some of the people that we're going to be talking about in this show, like John Cougar and Springsteen and there's somebody else, Jackson Brown. Do you think that lyrics are becoming more political and they're reflecting more of what's going on and maybe some of the problems that we're having in America today? Well,
this off-camera for you. Who you say you're going to be talking to them also in conjunction with this?
Yeah.
Okay. I think that there are certain writers around that put into their music and their lyrics songs that well, let me start over because I lost myself. I think there are certain artists around that put into their lyrics relative issues, you know, besides just the standard, like Phil was saying, I want to rock you all night long, you know, that does get overworked. There are some people around, I'm just trying to think of who they are because I'm kind of reaching one of those, you know, impasses in my head. Bruce Springsteen does come to mind though. He's definitely on the track, you know.
Let's play a little bit of musical association.
Okay.
Okay? And I'm going to name some people, again, people that we're going to be talking about in the show. And just sort of give me your personal views on them and if they had any effect on you as a musician. Woody Guthrie.
Woody Guthrie really isn't... I got introduced to Woody Guthrie really through Bob Dylan. Not personally, but he always talked about Woody Guthrie, and I didn't really know who he was until after Bob Dylan spoke of him, and then I went back and listened and got into him, but he didn't... I was like too late for me to really be influenced, you know, by him.
Do you think that, do you see a strong line between, say, Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan?
I think, from what I've read anyway, there's a direct line from Woody Guthrie to Bob Dylan, and probably from Bob Dylan to Bruce Springsteen and John Cougar Mellencamp. I think what John Cougar's doing, personally, like in 1985, I thought that was the best album of the year.
Hank Williams.
Hank Williams, I was also, again, too young to really hear it. I got into him later, and I heard a lot of other people doing his songs, and then I realized what a great songwriter he was. And I got one of those greatest hits collections and listened to him, and he was really amazing. His son's real amazing too.
Do you hear any of, are there any bands today that you hear Hank Williams in that you think have been real directly influenced by him?
Should never start with it. I think that Ricky Skaggs is very much influenced by Hank Williams, and I can't think of anybody. He just has a large effect over the country music market, especially traditional country. But I can't think of anyone in particular.
Okay, how about, it's okay because I can't either. How about Chuck Berry?
Chuck Berry is, can I be very candid? This is, in my opinion, if Chuck Berry had come along in the 80s, they would be calling him the king of rock and roll. But because he came along in the 50s and it was socially unacceptable to white people, you know, be very honest, he's just too black for white people, then especially. He's the guy who brought it all together to me. He wrote all these lyrics that everyone could relate to, that were all about kids at the time, and they're still universal when you hear them. And then he took a country rock feeling, country western feeling, and then put blues licks across the top, and presented this whole thing of the duck walk, and you know, I mean, like he was. I mean, Elvis was great, but I still think Chuck Berry was even better.
I agree. Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan is like a person who keeps going through all these changes right in front of our eyes, you know, and he tries a little of everything. Became a born-again Christian for a while, never, you know, and then I guess he's not quite as heavy into it now, but whatever he does is interesting, and this new thing that he's doing with Tom Petty is great. So he's like a pioneer, I guess.
Let's go back to the 60s and talk about Dylan for a second. Did he have any influence on you then? Were you a Dylan fan, or were you an admirer of what he was doing at the time?
Yeah, Bob Dylan was. I wasn't really into the kind of music he played. It was more folk rock, and I was more in the like rhythm blues or hard rock kind of music. Not like heavy metal is now, but hard rock. You know, this little place, Carl Perkins or James Brown. You know, that's different than heavy metal. Anyway. But I was a big fan of Bob Dylan and the songs that he wrote. And on a lot of the songs, I really liked the sound of his voice, the way he said things. You know, as soon as the song started, you knew it was the one and only Bob Dylan.
John Fogerty.
Well, it's kind of hard for me to talk about John and be unbiased, you know, because we're in the same band together. But I think that he had one of the most unique voices. I used to tell him, and I guess it's okay for me to say it, I was the first one that heard it. So I used to have to reinforce him and say, I think it's right up there with Ray Charles and Van Morrison. You know, it's a voice that's distinct, and everybody already really liked that voice. And I had no idea that he would go on to write such great songs too, though. So I think he's great.
What do you think with his last album? Do you think that they were really songs, again, that really reflected what was going on in America, as a lot of the Creedence stuff always seemed to?
Well, the last album was really painful for me because it sounded, the Old Man Down the Road sounded so much like Creedence that it was hard for me to get past that. So ultimately, I never bought the album. I never heard it.
Okay. Let's talk about that.
We're on tape.
Okay.
Country music, you know, kind of like how it all sort of came together, and in much the same way that Chuck Berry put it all together. It's, you know, it's the only thing I can think of.
You guys did songs such as, Bad Moon Rising and Fortunate Son and Lodi that sort of commented on America's working man's point of view. It came across very much that way. What was the inspiration for these songs?
I think, especially in terms of the way John would write, I think he was thinking not to just write the same old kind of love songs. We played around with a few love songs like Susie Q and I Put a Spell on You, those kind of
Musical tastes and influences. How do you think that propelled the music of the group along? How did that come out in the sound of Creedence?
Well, I think everybody in the band was feeling pretty much the same way about the way that pop music was in the middle 50s or late 50s when we first formed, and we didn't consciously go out of our way to try to sound like a black band. There was parts of country in it. It's just that it was really that we liked black music better than the kind of white music that was being presented to us at the time. That, for instance, the Philadelphia type of music that was being pawned off as rock and roll was not really what we thought it was about. So the rhythm and blues vocal groups of the West Coast and some of the ones from the East Coast, like the Five Satins, and on the West Coast, the Penguins and the Medallions. And then I got into the blues artists like Jimmy Reed and B.B. King a little bit, and Jesse Lee Sims. A lot of the... When I first started listening, there's no such thing as top 40 radio yet. So in order to hear what I liked, it was either black radio or pop stations that would play mostly Patti Page or something. So I wasn't too interested in that,
How do you think that your personal music looks good then?
He's all ready to go.
Yeah.
Tape speed.
Okay. Tom, in retrospect, Creedence Clearwater can certainly be hailed as the ultimate American band. Why do you think that is?
Oh, well, before I go on, should I mention Creedence Clearwater in the answer?
Creedence Clearwater, yeah.
Okay. Creedence Clearwater Revival is being remembered, you're saying remembered as an ultimate rock and roll band. I think it's a very nice compliment, and I really can't say why, other than just maybe the type of rock and roll that we chose to play. That was a combination of black and songs. But when John chose to write, he seemed to want to get deeper into what was going on at the time in the late 60s, and a lot of it had to do with the plight of the working man and young people, men and women, who were confronted with the war and how it was affecting them in a lot of ways, and he chose to write about that.
Who were the musical heroes of the bands?
That's a broad question. If you want to know who the musical heroes of the whole band were, it covers a lot of people.
Let's talk about you. Who were your musical heroes? Who did you grow up listening to?
I grew up listening mainly at the very beginning to the